Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namassami. On the full moon of May, we celebrated Vesak, the birth, enlightenment and passing away of Lord Buddha. And on our celebration day here, that is an opportunity that we provide each year for new Buddhists to formally take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts in the presence of the rest of the Buddhist community. And this year I had the honour of being the one who gave the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts to the group of people who were taking them for the first time. And I talked about what we mean by taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, and talked about the 5 precepts and what keeping them involves. And after I'd finished the ceremony, someone came up to me and said, "You know, I was going to take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts today, but after your talk you put me off. And I didn't take them with the group." And I said, "Oh dear, well, I'm very sorry that I did that. I didn't mean to have that effect on you. What was the problem?" And they said, "Well, you made it all sound so high, like you have to be, really sort of good already. And I don't feel that." And I said, "Yes, well, that's not what I was trying to convey." I said to the person, "Do you have confidence in the Buddha and the teachings?" "Oh, yes, they're the best thing I've found in my life. They're what I've been looking for all my life." And I said, "And do you have the intention and the aspiration to use the teaching and follow the path in your own life?" "Oh yes, no, I haven't taken them formally, but I've been doing it now for months, and I really want to live up to that." And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" And again he said, "Because you made it sound so good, so high, that I just don't feel that I'm up to it yet." And so I explained to him that we don't take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts when we're already perfect or when we've already got all the answers. We wouldn't need to take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts if we knew it all and if we were already doing it all. We take them because we recognise that we haven't got all the answers, but we have confidence that here is a teacher and a teaching that can show us the way. And that if we have the aspiration to become enlightened ourselves, and if we have the very clear intention, the wish to follow the teaching and to try to live in accordance with the 5 precepts, then that's fine, that's enough. That's the point at which we're ready to take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts. Sometimes people say, "Well, I like the idea of the teaching and I'd really like to be enlightened, but I'm not really sure about those 5 precepts. They seem too restrictive, too hard. I don't really know whether I believe that you need to keep all of those." And so at that point, that's a point where someone's really not ready to take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts, because the 5 precepts are an expression of the 3 refuges, an expression in our everyday experience of our deepest aspiration. And I said to this person, "Are you ready to really give it a try?" And he said, yes, I'm giving it a try. And I said, "That's good enough." And so I'm happy to say that he took the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts. But I thought that it's timely to once again talk about what we mean really when we're talking about taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, and what it involves and why we would want to voluntarily take up these 5 precepts, which do require us to restrict our speech and our behaviour, to confine it within the guidelines set out by the Buddha. So those of you who've heard this kind of talk before, or who've reflected on the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts before, I invite you not to just close your mind now to the rest of what I'm going to say, because one of the important aspects of taking the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts is to use them as constant reminders of what we aspire to in this life, and to give us something to continually gauge our thought, speech and action against, to see whether the way in which we are living and practicing is actually taking us in the direction that we want to head in. And I encourage people to take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts every day, once they've made the commitment to enlightenment, to their own enlightenment. I think it's very helpful at the beginning of every day to remind ourselves of how we want to live this day. Might be the last one that we have. What's most important for me today? What am I working towards building in my life? And at the beginning of every day, I like to remind myself that my goal, the thing that I prize most highly, is enlightenment, the purification of the mind of greed, hatred and delusion. And every time I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, I'm reminding myself of what I'm trying to rise up to. And doing that regularly makes it easier in the midst of daily activity to bring that reminder into the moment that's happening right now. It supports mindfulness of the quality of our thought, speech and action, because we remind ourselves again and again and again and again of what we really think is important. Now, when we take refuge in the Buddha, we do acknowledge our great debt to Sakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, because without that individual's efforts and without his willingness to pass on the profound truths which he discovered, we wouldn't have the path of practice to follow. So when we take refuge in the Buddha, it's not that we are now thinking that that historical person is still around and is going to save us or protect us. We know that he's passed away completely. But we do acknowledge our connection with him. And that connection goes back over 2,600 years, over lifetimes of practice, which we may or may not be fully aware of in this life itself. But we understand that none of us would be here in this hall with these teachings to use if it wasn't for that individual. So while we acknowledge our connection to the historical Buddha, when we take refuge in Buddha, we are actually taking refuge in our own potential to become enlightened. We are acknowledging that each one of us has the capacity to develop to be wise, to understand at the deepest level of reality. And this capacity is the capacity to reflect on our experience, to investigate our experience, to contemplate our experience, and to develop discernment about how we're going to live our lives, how we're going to decide how to live our lives. This capacity for mindful reflection is the quality of Buddha, of knowing. And it's this that becomes our refuge. This capacity to stand back from the experience of the moment and make an informed decision about whether this is going to take me to happiness or to suffering. And when we take refuge in Buddha, the root Bud in Pali means to know. We are taking refuge in this potential to know. And this is very important for us to understand, because it's this capacity to be mindful, to be awake, to know, that we bring into our daily life. In the moment, before we say or do, the capacity to stop and reflect, to be aware of consequences, not only what's happening now, but what this will give rise to. When we take the 5 precepts, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the precepts, the first one is, I undertake the way of training to refrain from harming living beings. And the positive aspect is to cultivate love and compassion. The second precept is, I undertake the way of training to refrain from taking what is not given. And the positive aspect is to cultivate generosity, not only of material things, but of our time and our energy, our tolerance, all of those aspects of generosity. The third precept is, I undertake the way of training to refrain from sexual misconduct, and the positive aspect of that is to develop contentment with what I have and reliability in my commitments. The fourth precept is, I undertake the way of training to refrain from wrong speech, speech which is dishonest or harsh or tale-bearing or nonsense, and to try to cultivate speech which is truthful, kind, harmonizing, and is about what matters. And the last is, I undertake the way of training to refrain from using drugs and alcohol, which confuse the mind, which make it easy to break all of the other precepts. And the positive aspect is to try to cultivate the mind in meditation, particularly to develop this capacity to be mindful, to be reflective, to know our experience. When we take the 5 precepts, we can't hope to keep them or use them as guidelines for our speech and behaviour without mindfulness, without this ability to observe ourselves, without this ability to be awake and aware in the present moment with what I'm just about to say, with what I'm just about to do. Without this capacity, without developing this potential, then keeping the precepts becomes very much a matter of hit and miss. Our habitual patterns, our automatic way of reacting to situations will always overrule us and push us into self-centered speech and behaviour unless we are able to take a moment, put the brakes on and stop and think about it. And this capacity to be mindful is our refuge. How do we know what is helpful and not helpful? How do we know what is going to take us to happiness and what is going to take us to suffering? When we take refuge in the Dharma, we take refuge in the teaching that the Buddha gave, because through his own experience he developed this profound understanding of life, of the mind, of what produces happiness in human beings, what leads to harmony in social relationships. And he taught those truths which we can cultivate for ourselves. And we have to understand that these are truths, these are realities. The Buddha wasn't teaching anything that we can't prove for ourselves if we take up the practice and follow the instructions. And if we take up the practice and follow the instructions, then the Buddha guarantees that the result will be peace and happiness. And when we take refuge in the Dharma, we are taking refuge in that truth which is available to be discovered, to be known by each one of us for ourselves. And this is why when we have confidence in the teacher and recognise that we ourselves have to do the work, then we are willing to take the precepts, because this is what the Buddha has said is the basic standard of behaviour if you want to live happily in this life, and prepare the mind for the work of meditation. Now we are encouraged to investigate that for ourselves, not just to believe it. We're not taking refuge in something that someone else has told us that we don't have confidence in. And so we investigate for ourselves, and not only in terms of the 5 precepts, but in terms of how we live our lives ordinarily. Is it true that when we're not paying attention, we don't really choose our reactions? They come automatically just according to our habit patterns, to our conditioning. At what point can I make a conscious decision not to do what I've already done? What conditions need to be present in my mind, in my life, before I'm willing to say no to an urge that comes into the mind? How easy is it for me to refrain from just saying what I've always said in this situation, even when I know that it always leads me into an argument? We start to investigate in terms of the truths, in terms of the laws of the way the mind works, the way experience is produced. We may not believe what the Buddha said. We may not believe that the Dharma is telling us the truth. So we take a look and see, well, what do I really know from my own experience? And what does the Dharma tell me that I can investigate, put to the test in my own experience? So when we take the precepts, or we don't keep the precepts, we examine what happens in our life. Whether there's more confusion or more clarity, whether there's more conflict or more peace. And when we are doing this, we need to have mindfulness. We need to have that quality of Buddha, the one who knows. Or we can't do this kind of investigation. And when we do it, and we recognize that the teaching that the Buddha gave, the way that he explains the mind, the way he explains experience and how it's produced, that seems to be accurate. Even though I can't do it perfectly, the blueprint seems to be an accurate one. And that's when we develop the willingness to take refuge in the Dharma. The third refuge is the refuge in the Sangha. And in this particular context, the Sangha refers to those men and women, monks and nuns, laymen and laywomen, who have been able to realize any stage on the path to enlightenment, have developed the same kind of understanding of reality that the Buddha had. And we understand that to reach that point, they have had to put into practice the teaching that was given by the Buddha. And in doing that, they have become extraordinary beings. And we aspire to become extraordinary also. You can't become extraordinary unless you're willing to let go of what is ordinary. And what is ordinary, the Buddha said, for all of us, is greed, hatred and delusion. We also have, each one of us, the potential for non-greed, for generosity, for renunciation, for willingness to share, for simplicity, for contentment. But we have to develop that. We have to encourage it to grow. We all have the capacity, the potential, not only for hatred, but for loving kindness and compassion, for tolerance, for care, for kind-heartedness. But we have to nurture those qualities and make them grow. we also have the capacity for wisdom, not just ignorance. Otherwise there would be no point in taking up the path of practice. In order to allow the greed, hatred and delusion to diminish, we need to actively cultivate and develop the wholesome qualities of mind. Now, one of the ways in which we cut across the self-centeredness that leads to greed and hatred is to commit ourselves to the 5 precepts, to a very high standard of virtue, which requires us again and again to say no to our selfish impulses. And in saying no to those selfish impulses, we gradually reduce the power that they have to dictate our speech and our actions in the world. And every time we say no, we naturally, automatically strengthen the wholesome qualities, even the wholesome quality of just knowing this should be let go of, this should not be followed. That in itself is wholesomeness. That is in itself strengthening the mindfulness that takes us away from what is unskillful and towards what is helpful and wholesome. As well as committing ourselves to the 5 precepts and trying to live up to that standard, we also actively cultivate other qualities, going out of our way to be kind, to be generous, to be honest, to be courageous, to be tolerant, all of those virtues which don't just develop without effort, without putting energy into them, without seeing how valuable they are to making for a life of ease, to increasing our own happiness. We might think that this is a struggle that seems endless and that it requires superhuman effort if we're going to purify the mind. It does require constant effort, but it doesn't have to be superhuman, particularly in the beginning. It simply requires that we make a clear commitment to our own purification. And then, little by little, we work at reducing what is unwholesome in our life and growing what is wholesome. And one of the nice similes which you might have heard before, which helps us to understand how we do this again and again and again, just in the small decisions that we make, the small actions that we take, is from the Native American tradition. And this is the story about the 2 dogs. Once a wise teacher said that he had 2 dogs inside him. And one was a good dog and one was the bad dog. And they were constantly fighting. The good dog to move him in the direction of what was wholesome, and the bad dog to try and control so that he was moved in the direction of what wasn't wholesome. And these dogs were constantly doing battle. And someone asked him, well, which dog wins? And the answer was, the one I feed is the one that wins, because that one becomes the stronger. Now in this metaphor, we understand that we don't have to kill off the bad part of us. We don't have to get into a violent struggle with the bits of us that we don't like, or the parts of our speech and behaviour that we think give us problems. One of the ways that we deal with this is simply not to feed those kinds of behaviours by refraining from indulging in them. And that's why the 5 precepts and our commitment to them are so supportive for doing this. But also, the more that we actively cultivate what is good, go out of our way to be honest when it's not advantageous, to be kind when it takes a lot of patience, to be generous when we really would rather have it for ourselves. Whenever we cultivate those good qualities, we automatically strengthen the wholesome and weaken what is unwholesome. And so we don't have to do battle. It becomes a natural process of wearing away what takes us to suffering. And the 5 precepts are so helpful because they give us a very clear guidelines. They show us the exact places where we need to be careful, where we need to put in this kind of effort. So we don't have to guess, what things should I really be doing if I want to cultivate this path. It's there in front of us. All we need to do is to have the intention to do it. And very often we'll find that we fail. And we fail because the tendencies in the mind which take us in the direction of greed, hatred and delusion are very deeply rooted. And we can't expect that even though we want to walk in the direction of what is pure, that we're going to be able to do that immediately. And so again, if we understand how the mind works, we will see that very often the mind will still be full of what is unskillful. And at that moment, because of our commitment to enlightenment, our intention to walk in that direction, that even while anger is still present, with mindfulness, with our refuge in the knowing, and our commitment and confidence in the path of practice, even when anger is present, we know that this is not useful, this is not for our well-being, and we put the brake on at that moment. We restrain ourselves, and even if anger is there in the mind, we don't let it produce angry speech or angry behaviour. Even when desire is present, we know that desire, but we don't let it drive us to speech and action. Now, this is a very important point, because very often we think that we can't pretend that we're not angry. If we're angry, we should let it out, and we should wait until there's absolutely no anger there before we don't speak in an angry way. We think we're hypocritical if we feel angry, and then we try not to say something that's angry. But this is wrong understanding. The mind changes long after the speech and the behaviour. Until you're enlightened, until you're a long way on the path, the self-centred approach to things will be there. only at the point of the third stage of the path, the non-returner, greed and hatred disappear. So it's a long way to go before we get to the point where anger never arises, where greed never arises. And the practice is to know when it's present, but not to act on it. And the difference between this mindfulness, this knowing, and this wise action, and being a hypocrite, is that when you're a hypocrite, you pretend to yourself, or you may even pretend to others, that those unwholesome qualities are not present in the mind. You try to fool yourself. You might try to fool others. You're trying to mask what's really going on. But with mindfulness, with knowing, with wisdom, we're aware that something unskillful is present in the mind, but we don't act on it. Now, to get to that point is already a great step forward. To be able to refrain, to be able to restrain oneself, already requires tremendous strength of mind. And that strength of mind is built up every time we are cultivating that knowing quality. And every time we stop ourselves before we say or do something which we'll later regret. And if we want to know which of those things which we'll later regret, we look at the 5 precepts and see what areas of are the ones that I need to be careful around. And also, what areas do I need to develop? Which qualities do I need to put some effort into? Honesty, contentment, reliability. They're all great qualities which require tremendous effort if we're going to bring them to life in our own experience. So taking refuge and precepts is not just the beginning of the path, it's really something which continues as a focal point for our growth in wisdom and also for our growth in compassion. As we struggle with our own defilements, as we struggle to live up to our aspirations, as we struggle to keep the precepts, we experience what it's like, how difficult it is to become masters of our own mind, to become masters of our own speech and action. And however much we are in touch with our own inner struggle, that much we understand of others' inner struggle. We recognise that just as it's difficult for me, so it must be difficult for everyone else. So instead of being critical and judgmental of others, instead of feeling that people should be able to get their act together, or they should be able to get rid of the things in their life that cause them problems, we recognise that it's not so easy for me and it's not so easy for them. And so compassion can arise. The understanding of the predicament that we're all in, this common ground that we all share. Once we have confidence in the teacher and the teaching, and we have a sincere intention to try to live up to our aspiration and to put into practice the 5 precepts in our life, then that is the time, then it's very supportive to formally take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts. When we take something openly, when we have to declare it to others, then that makes a much stronger impact on the mind. We have to be prepared to explain ourselves. Someone asks us, well, what do you mean taking refuge? Or what does it mean to you to try and live up to the aspiration for enlightenment? Or why do you think it's important not to do this or to do that? It becomes much more a part of how we express ourselves in our daily life. And so that's why it's very useful to take the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts, to openly declare that that is the intention that we have in our life, because that will reinforce what we hold to be most precious in our own mind as we go about our everyday life. I'd just like to finish with a story which again doesn't come from the Buddhist tradition, but which I think illustrates what this path is about. That we're not perfect in the beginning, and we're not perfect for a lot of the time that we're practicing it, but we are aware of the direction that we want our life to go in. One time there was a kingdom where there lived a very highly respected holy man. And this holy man was very wise and very kind, and people would often go and ask for his advice. And even the king would go and ask advice from the holy man. And the king wanted to show his respect to the holy man, so he commissioned the most famous artist in the country to paint a portrait of the holy man. And when the portrait was painted on a ceremonial occasion, the portrait was brought into the royal palace, and the artist was present, and the holy man was there to bless the event. And when the portrait was unveiled, the king was aghast, because the face in the picture certainly had a resemblance to the features of the holy man, but the face that was looking out looked terrible. It looked brutish. It looked depraved. It certainly didn't look like the face of anyone who lived a virtuous life. And the king was very angry that the artist had misrepresented the holy man so badly, and he called the guards to take the artist away to the dungeon. And the holy man looked at the portrait and said, "No, wait, Your Majesty, wait. This is a very good likeness. There in this picture, I see the face of the person that I've practiced all my life not to become." The king understood that you don't become holy without effort. And the cultivation of virtue is something which needs to continue throughout our life until we reach the final goal of complete enlightenment. So I encourage all of you to reflect on this in the light of your own experience with the practice, to use the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts as a support, as a linchpin, if you like, for how you live your life and how you cultivate the path in your daily life. It's only by this kind of fundamental establishing ourselves in virtue that we can hope to develop the mind in meditation and develop it to the point where it gives rise to wisdom and deep understanding. So may this teaching be of benefit to all of us, and I would respectfully like to dedicate the merit of tonight's teaching to Ayya Siri, who is an American nun whom I knew in Sri Lanka many years ago, who passed away just last week. I would like to dedicate the merits of this evening's teachings to her and wish for all of us that it may help us all, and particularly Ayya Siri, to attain Nibbana. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for the question. The question is about, is there a place for the positive expression of anger, and that suppressing anger can be harmful and the expression of it can be cleansing. Is there a place for expressing anger in the teaching? So, first of all, we're not talking about suppressing anger in the sense of not knowing that it's present. Very often when we're suppressing something, we're not aware that we are experiencing that emotion. And the quality of mindfulness that knows the aspect of Buddha is the quality that we're trying to develop so that we can be fully aware of what is going on in our mind, in our emotions. We're aware of anger, but that doesn't mean that we have to act on the anger or even to express the anger. Now, when we think about expressing anger, we think about speaking or acting in an angry manner. With mindfulness, we might express that anger is present, but we're not speaking or acting in an angry manner. So we are aware of the presence of anger, we acknowledge the presence of anger, but we try not to speak or act with anger in the words and in the action that we do. Now, one of the understandings of the way the mind works is that the more that we repeat a particular thought pattern, particular speech pattern or particular behaviour, the more entrenched that becomes. And so it's a misunderstanding in terms of the Buddha's teaching to think that the more we give something expression, we're going to get rid of it in that way. In fact, we just become better at expressing it. It just makes a deeper groove in the mind. It's the same with people saying, well, if I indulge my craving, that will get rid of it. And we only have to investigate whether that's true to see, no, we've still got craving, even though we've indulged it countless times. Anger is the same. So it's not about pretending the anger isn't there, and it's not about pushing it down. When one becomes sufficiently mindful and the mind becomes strong enough through the cultivation of what is wholesome, then one is able to hold anger, know that anger is present, feel the anger, but not speak or act on the anger. Now that doesn't happen overnight. That is the result of the cultivation of all aspects of the path. Now, it's like trying to be peaceful in meditation. Peacefulness in meditation doesn't arise just because we're meditating. Meditation has to be supported by the way we use our mind in daily life. It has to be supported by not feeding the unwholesome tendencies in the mind in ordinary situations, by cultivating, actively developing wholesome qualities. And then, when we sit down to meditate, the mind will gradually, over time, become more peaceful. So being able to hold anger, feel anger, know anger is present but not act on anger, express it in another way, maybe I am angry, or recognizing anger is there, but not allowing it to dictate to one, that takes time and cultivation of the path. There's no place in Buddhism for righteous anger. That doesn't mean that we don't act forcefully when required. We don't sit back and allow people to walk all over us or to harm others if we see that there's something we can do to help that situation or help that person. But there's no sense of an eye for an eye or paying back someone in kind. But this isn't easy to do. I was telling people who brought our meal today, brought the dana to the monastery today, that I had an incident this week when I was angry, and I kept telling myself, "You're angry, don't say anything. Walk away." So walk away. I was still angry, and eventually I said it, even though I knew, and all my training and all my wisdom told me that it was an unskillful thing to say. But the defilement won in that situation. Afterwards I regretted it. So I hope I learned next time to walk away for a bit longer. Well, the way that we understand the mind, and this is again, the Buddha was a master of explaining how the mind works. In the description of how our experience is produced, it is produced according to causes and conditions. This is the teaching on non-self, that there's nothing unchangeable in our what we take to be our core experience of who we are. And when we encounter an experience, it lays down a memory of that experience, both mentally and physically. And that memory is triggered again when we are in a similar situation. The same kind of reaction arises in the mind. And in the way that the Buddha was able to dissect our reactions in very fine tuning of what actually happens, the old reaction, the Vedana, is produced automatically when we find ourselves in the same or similar situation again. And our interpretation of the Vedana and how we deal with it is actually a mind moment past or later than the arising of the initial experience. And so the training is to come to the point where the experience arises again as a result of previous conditioning. We know, we experience, we recognize what that is, but we don't act on it in the present moment. Now this is a more profound level, if you like, of the cultivation of the path. One has to develop sufficient mindfulness and stability of mind, clarity of mind, to be alert to that process in the present moment, to start to recognize it, to be able to recognize it without being pushed along by it. And so we're not talking about suppressing something. We're talking about eventually coming to the point where we can hold that reaction. The mind has become a strong enough container to hold that reaction, but not to be affected by it. So anger, for example, is experienced as a range of bodily sensations, unpleasant, and a range of mental feelings which are unpleasant, and it's that unpleasantness that we react against, not the object that created it. And this again is one of the subtle points of the Buddha's understanding of the way the mind works. So we can see this in things when they're not too big an issue, when they're not too drastic, that something produces a reaction in us, we can turn away from that object just to pay attention to our reaction, see it arise and pass away. We're engrossed in our own internal environment. We recognise that that is conditioned by what we come in contact with, but that whatever is produced is temporary, stays for a while and passes away. So we are getting to the point where we can tolerate that unpleasantness while it stays and passes away. But to develop that capacity to tolerate, that is the strength of mind that arises out of the cultivation of the path. And at different times the strength of mind will be greater or weaker depending on many factors, not just the object that gives rise to the reaction, but whether we're tired, whether we're hungry, whether we're stressed for other reasons, whether we're alone, whether we're with other people, all sorts of things. So this is what we're also starting to see. All of these reactions which we take to be mine and I've got to do something about it are the result of causes and conditions. It's all been explained by the Buddha very clearly. We just have to keep on practicing until we can not only see it for ourselves but also do it. As much as we can do it, that much will be more peaceful and more at ease with our life. Well, I think probably that's enough. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd like to ask Albert to make the announcements. Thank you.